Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the Extra Mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now, your host, Jackson Mummy, owner of the Celebration Bar Review.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. This is your host, Jackson Mummy. I'm glad to be with you. Hope everyone is doing well. We are in the middle of October, if you're listening to this or watching this as we release, and we are still waiting, as I'm recording today, for the dreaded and often anticipated New York bar exam results. They have not been released yet. My spidey sense was that they would have been out by now, so I've missed it. But they're coming, I promise. They will be here, perhaps even between the time I'm recording this and the time this episode is released. In any event, good luck to those of you waiting for your results, not just in New York, but certainly in California and Georgia and around the country where results have still not come out. Now, in the last week or so, we did get results in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, a couple of other smaller UBE states, and congratulations to everyone who passed. If you were one of the people that did not pass, hang in there, keep your head up. We've got lots of resources and tools on this podcast and in our course to assist you specifically, and we'll be talking about those in just a few more minutes. In fact, today's episode is actually a continuation of last week's episode, where we talked about part one of what I called changing paradigms and pattern recognition on the bar exam. Now, in last week's episode, if you haven't checked it out, it's celebrationbarreview.com/274. I talked about the idea of the non-conscious brain and how we learn non-consciously and how much more powerful that is than our conscious brain. It's a changed paradigm from the way most bar takers think about their study and how they learn. And it's important information for what we're going to discuss today. Because in today's episode, I'm going to take that a step further and then talk about something called pattern recognition. And that's a technique and a term that's built on this idea of using the non-conscious brain to identify patterns in material, patterns in questions, patterns in answers that you can use for every part of your bar exam. Multiple choice questions, essays, performance tests, every part. And so we're going to dive deeper into pattern recognition today. I'm really excited about this message. I hope you'll stick around. And you can either watch it or listen to it. If you prefer to watch today's episode, you can find it at celebrationbarreview.com/275. That's the video version. If you prefer to listen to the podcast, you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, on iTunes Radio, on iHeartRadio, on radio.com, all sorts of places, virtually any place that podcasts are syndicated. And we'd love to have you subscribe and become a member of our community. We come out with these episodes once a week, and we're glad to have you with us. And if this is your first time with us on the podcast, well, welcome. We're glad to have you here as well. Now, before we jump into today's message, I want to let you know that our episode is being brought to you by our all-new training webinar. It's called Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. We're going to take a look at the steps that successful bar takers have followed to go from failing to passing on their exam. You're going to hear from many of them in their own words in video clips that we've done, and we're going to show you step-by-step what you need to do. Now, this webinar can be life-changing, particularly if you've taken and failed your bar exam anywhere in the country. And it's completely free, and best of all, it's provided on demand. So you can watch this webinar at your convenience, date and time that works best for you. All you have to do is register and sign up, and then you can jump on to watch at whatever is the best, most convenient time. In order to register, you can go to the show notes on the video or the audio of today's episode. You'll see a button there to sign up, or you can go to our website at celebrationbarreview.com/webinar and sign up there. It is a terrific program. We've updated it. We've been giving this webinar for years and had thousands of people go through it with great success. And it really is a life changer. I say that, and sometimes people think I'm exaggerating, but in fact, passing the bar will change your life. And this is the first step to passing the bar. This is where most people that come to our course start by going through this free 90-minute training. So I encourage you to do that. Hop on, take a look. If you've got questions during the webinar, there's even a place for you to send a note directly to us and we'll respond promptly. So it's really all the best parts of a webinar without having to be on somebody else's schedule. So I do hope you'll check that out. All right. Well, again, we're sitting here waiting for results. We know they're coming soon. But in the meantime, while we're waiting, or if you got your results and they weren't favorable and you're getting ready for the 2020 exams, I think it's really important to understand how to study. And in today's message, we're going to dive deeper, as I said, into this idea of pattern recognition for the bar exam. So let's jump into today's message. Well, welcome back to part 2 of our series on changing paradigms and pattern recognition in the bar exam. And it's a really important subject. I started it in a previous discussion about changing paradigms. If you haven't watched or listened to that, I encourage you to do that. We'll put a link in the notes for you. But to briefly recap, what I talked about in the first part of this series was the importance of changing your paradigm when it comes to studying for the bar exam. We use the example of an iceberg. What we see above the surface is much smaller than what's below the surface, and that's a very good representation of the way the conscious and non-conscious brain works. And we looked at the reality that the non-conscious brain has much greater cognitive skills and the ability to draw in much more information than the cognitive brain, the conscious brain has. And the result of that is that we are capable of doing much more than we think we're capable of doing when it comes to studying, when it comes to reading, when it comes to retaining information, and so on. So really the essence, the quick takeaway from the first lesson was that you have extraordinary skills that you can manifest in a lot of different ways. Now, we use tools like PhotoReading and Paraliminals and mind mapping to make greater advantage of them. But even if you've never heard of those things and you never use them, you have the same cognitive ability, and you have within you right now a reservoir of information about the law, about the bar exam, from law school, from life, from the practice of law, from your bar studies previously. From all of those sources, you have a great deal of information. That leads us to today's question and problem, which is, how do I then get at all that information that's below the surface, that's not just the tip of the iceberg, but the deeper part of our understanding? And that's what we want to look at today when we talk about something called pattern recognition. Now, in order to break this conversation into more meaningful chunks, I'm going to basically break it into 3 discussions. The first is I want to just look generally at what pattern recognition is. And secondly, I want to talk about why that's so important for the bar exam. And then I want to finish up by talking about how you use the technique of pattern recognition, both in your study and on test day. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Well, let's go ahead and jump right into the first question, which, if you've never heard the term before and you heard about pattern recognition, what does it bring to mind? Well, as you see in the background here, I've got a bit of a pattern. This is a pattern of ice or water. And if you're paying attention to it, if you're looking at it, you see that it's a repeating pattern, but it's got some distinctions in it. Are we talking about that kind of pattern recognition? Not really. You might have heard about pattern recognition for machine learning or artificial intelligence. In other words, an AI machine sees a pattern, it applies an algorithm, and it reaches a conclusion. And this is how voice recognition works. It's how a lot of the intelligent assistants that we've got in technology is working today. Well, it's not quite that either. So pattern recognition gets used in a lot of different contexts, but for our purposes, we're going to go back to something that you absolutely recall, and it's called a fact pattern. Remember when you first got to law school and people would talk to you about fact patterns, and they'd say, what did you see in that fact pattern? And you might have thought to yourself, what do they mean by a fact pattern? Isn't it a fact narrative or a fact story or just a problem that's in front of me? But you remember that we consistently called it a fact pattern. And the reason goes to a deep root of the way the law is structured. If you step back and think about what law is, functionally, it is the ability to take a set of rules and apply them in different circumstances with some degree of consistency. In other words, we had a set of rules about that govern a contract, but they can't govern every contract without creating a new set of rules for each one. That would be cumbersome and impossible. So what a system of laws does is it says, here are the general principles, now apply them in this setting to these situations. And so what we do is we take those sets of rules and we put them on top of different fact problems. As we do that, we create a pattern. We say to ourselves, here's a problem we've got in this contract about signatures, or about offer and acceptance, or about consideration, or the mailbox rule, or whatever it might be, the statute of frauds, whatever the problem is. And we do that and say to ourselves, That's a fact pattern. I've seen that pattern happen before. I know how to apply the law because I know the pattern of the problem. Now, this is important to us because when we talk about pattern recognition, functionally what we're talking about is your ability to see the patterns in your study and on the bar exam days itself in the questions, and to be able to take those patterns and allow that to trigger the non-conscious learning that you had below the sea level, if you will, of your iceberg, and to be able to use that information to solve the problems. Now, if you think about the way the human experience is, we live in a world of patterns. We do things in patterns by habit and repetition all the time. You have a pattern for your morning, typically. You have a pattern for getting to work at the beginning of your day. You have a pattern for the tasks, perhaps, that you do at certain times of the day. You create patterns. I just had the experience of being around my one-year-old grandson for a few days, and I was struck by how much pattern learning we teach right from the very beginning of life. My grandson has a pattern for going to take his nap. He has a pattern for eating. He has a pattern for playing. And part of the growth of the human mind is that we build on these patterns. They start small, and then they're enlarged. There's a pattern that leads to another pattern that leads to another pattern. And we link all of those patterns together and we begin to live our lives. Patterns are important in the law because they help us see the connections between various pieces of information. I had a conference with a student recently in which the student told me that evidence was a very difficult subject for her. And I said, well, is it really the rules of evidence that are difficult? And she said, no, not so much. It just seems like there's a lot of random rules out there. And she's exactly right. Because she was learning the rules independently, learning them as a rule in one spot and a rule in another place and a rule in a third place, there was no connectivity, there was no pattern to it. But when we started to put it into a pattern of the rules, for example, here are the hearsay rules, here are the exceptions to hearsay, here are the things that are not hearsay. Oh, there's a pattern to that. And when we see the pattern to it, we're then able to use the material. It's not so much that any subject is difficult, it's that we typically don't see patterns. When people tell me that they have trouble with constitutional law in the bar exam, it's often because they're thinking in these abstract terms of here's a rule or a principle or a holding, and it has no connection to anything else they've learned. So it becomes this series of random rules. And if you've been trying to memorize with flashcards or mnemonics or rhymes or rhythms or whatever you're using, you're going to find that there's a finite capacity there. You're only using what's above the surface of the water. You're not using the non-conscious brain at all. And so the result of that is that as you get more information in, you have to push old information out. And because it's not connected or patterned, you have no ability to use it. It simply comes in, goes out, and it's deposited outside your brain, and it's of no use to you. So pattern recognition becomes a very effective way to hold on to information. In fact, the people that teach memorization often talk about remembering items either through a mnemonic or rooms in your mental house. Why do they do that? It creates a pattern. The more patterns you create, the easier it is for our brain to take that information and grab hold of it and know where to find it. So if I know there's a pattern, I know where to look for information in the heart of what I'm trying to do to solve the problem. Now, if you think that that's too abstract or too academic, let me just suggest that throughout our lives, we see patterns every day and we react to them typically even non-consciously. There is a pattern when you go to your coffee shop and you know where to stand in line and what to order. And there's a pattern when you see that the person at the cash register is new and they can't figure out how to ring something in, or the barista doesn't know quite how to make the drinks. You have a whole series of patterns in your brain that tell you what the result of that's going to be. Oh, my drink's going to be bad, or it's going to take too long, or I'm going to be late for work. We do this kind of pattern connection all the time in every capacity of our lives. And the same is true when it comes to the bar exam and studying for the bar exam. What is pattern recognition? Well, essentially, it's a way we decode the world in front of us. It's a way we decode the bar exam and the law that we're learning and the materials that we're studying. It puts information together in ways that make it useful and usable to our brains consciously, even though the hard work is being done non-consciously below the surface. Now, that's important. So that's our first idea. Pattern recognition. It is a principle that we use all the time in every part of our lives, but now we want to apply it specifically to our studies. So that leads me to the second thing I wanted to talk about today, which is why is pattern recognition important for the bar exam? If you go back to your law school experience again, and you think about the way you learned in law school, for most of us, it was Socratic study. It was, here's a case, we read it in our case books or textbooks or online, and then we come to class and the professor discusses it with the students in the class. And in the process of decoding the case and looking at it, we begin to explore the ramifications and the parameters of the law. How is this rule really being applied? When you think about the bar exam is nothing other than a series of fact patterns being placed in front of you, both in multiple choice and in essay, and even in performance tests, and then asking you to decode it. What is the result, the answer, the resolution to this problem? Now, sadly, as I've talked about in many places, bar takers get this basic concept of the bar exam confused all the time. They think the bar exam is about how many rules you can recite and what you can spit back to the examiners. This focus to the exclusion of all else on memorization and recitation gets you away from what the bar examiners really are testing, which is your ability to solve problems, to act and think like a lawyer. When you act and think like a lawyer, what you're really doing is applying pattern recognition. You're saying, okay, this problem in front of me, this client in front of me, presents a problem very similar to one that I know about, or I've seen, or I've worked on, or I've read about, or I've studied, and therefore I can apply the principles that I found in these other situations to this problem to resolve it. That is the essential function of a lawyer. Take the rule, apply it from case A to case B to reach the result that you want. Now, the bar examiners know that that's true, and therefore they are not creating random, untethered questions. For example, they don't say, tell us all the rules of negligence. You don't see that question on the bar exam. You don't see questions that say, how many days do you get to file a particular motion? For the most part, that's not the kind of testing that's done on the bar exam. Certainly not the uniform bar exam or the multi-state bar exam or the performance test, and generally speaking, not even in the essays in most state exams. Instead, what's happening on the bar exam is that you're getting a series of questions that look very much like other questions and other problems that frame up the law in that particular field. So if you're a bar examiner, what you're doing is you say to yourself, I want to test the mailbox rule in contracts. Well, I don't ask a question and say, what's the mailbox rule? What I do is I create, you can say it with me, a fact pattern that sets up that problem, that gives the basics, and you see that party A put a response or made an offer, party B put their response in the mail or in whatever electronic form we've got these days, and they delivered it, and the two answers crossed in transit, either cyber transit or real mail transit. And you would then say, okay, given that situation, how do we solve this problem? Either as an essay problem or as a multiple choice problem. In doing that, what the applicant has to do is to say, okay, I see that. It is a pattern that I've seen before. I know that there's a rule called the mailbox rule. Now I'm applying that mailbox rule to this set of facts, this particular problem. I'm doing pattern recognition and then applying to get to a result. Therefore, for the bar examiners, this allows them to have a standardized and a very consistent set of testing. If our testing was inconsistent, if it measured different skills all the time, it would be hard to make it equal over time. But the National Conference of Bar Examiners has, in fact, done something really remarkable. They have managed to make their multi-state bar exam equate from today all the way back to the first time it was given in the 1970s. They've done that by standardizing the fact patterns. That is, the rule against perpetuities hasn't changed much over the years. Now, we can ask the question in lots of different ways, but the fundamentals of the rule will stay the same. The same is true for tort negligence or contract law or virtually any principle that's in contemporary law. We simply create a pattern around that problem so that we can then say, can applicants in 1970 or in 2020 still reach the same conclusion based on a relatively common set of facts? That's why fact patterns are so important to bar examiners. It helps them to standardize the test. And you should know that as a bar taker, because what it then means is you're going to be able to focus on the fact pattern instead of focusing on the raw material of the underlying law. Now, the other beauty of the fact pattern and pattern recognition for the bar exam is that it lets the examiners effectively recycle questions over time. It's not uncommon, and certainly you can probably relate to this experience from law school. You probably had professors that recycled exam questions every few years. In fact, I remember vividly going into the library. That was that building with books, for those of you that are younger. And we would look at old exams from some of our professors that had been around a long time. And sure enough, those questions would come back, not word for word, but the same problems would come back to us, just with different names and maybe a different setting, but exactly the same pattern. And that was the key. Now, the bar examiners do the same thing. We can change the parties' names, we can change what's happening, but we are creating a pattern. A recent example of this, in a bad way, was in the Florida bar exam on an essay question. Recently, there was a question that asked about a statute that would prohibit tattoos being given without pre-consent and a certain waiting period. Now, that should be making some of you think, tattoos, waiting period, consent, you need to go to the doctor. Does that sound like anything else you've heard of? Could be maybe a stand-in for an abortion question. The pattern is exactly the same. The examiners wanted to ask a question around abortion, but they weren't going to use that word. So they used a filler called tattoos, and then they wrote a question that was exactly the same. You could write that same question on any number of subjects, tattoos, or going to see I've got a coffee addiction, right? I mean, whatever it might be, and we could put that fact pattern in or change those facts, but still have an underlying problem that's exactly the same. And we see this all the time on the bar exam. That's why having these questions is so important. Now, I know that there are people who say, all I'm going to do is practice questions. And to some extent, there's a wisdom in practicing questions, but you've got to understand what it is you're looking for. Just doing the questions by themselves is not enough. And so the idea here is to be able to use the patterns. In our course, we have questions, license questions going back into the 1990s. And students often say, why do you have such old questions? Well, we have them because the patterns are identical. You can take a question from 1992 and a question from 2020, and you can find the same pattern, even though the form of the question, the parties' names, the circumstances, the details are different, but the pattern of the problem remains identical. And so if you can identify that pattern, it's going to be helpful to you as a bar taker. But it's absolutely critical to the way the bar exam is written in every part. Now, I haven't talked much about performance tests, but for those of you in jurisdictions where there are performance tests, this is the classic case of patterns. There are really 4 patterns or 4 types of performance tests based on audience and tone. We teach those in our course, and we teach students what to look for in the patterns. More importantly, there are patterns of information you want to find in the library and patterns of information in the file. And given those patterns, if you know what to look for, what to recognize, then you can draft an answer that's going to be in more depth, have more content, be more robust than if you're just randomly scattered around looking for information and throwing it on the page. And so pattern recognition plays a part in virtually every part of the bar exam. All right, so we've got pattern recognition. We know it's out there. We know that it's a part of the human experience, the way we learn, the way we translate the world in front of us, the way we interpret the world, the way we connect up random events and things going on around us. We know it's important for the bar exam because it provides consistency over time. It provides reliability in the questions that are being asked and the answers that turn out to be correct. We know that it's important because it measures the skill that lawyers actually have to use, and therefore it's a reliable indicator for the bar examiners of your readiness to practice law. Now, having taken all of those things, now we get to the real meat of this, which is how do you use the technique of pattern recognition? And I want to look at it, as I said, both in terms of study and on bar exam day. When it comes to studying, pattern recognition, I think, is particularly important in a couple of different respects. Remember, I talked about the student that said evidence was hard for her. When we broke that down and said, let's use a technique called mind mapping, it really made a difference, and here's why. When we put, for example, the area of hearsay, and we wrote it out on a sheet of paper, and we put hearsay in the middle of our page, and then we drew out different branches from that to talk about hearsay, the rule itself, and the exceptions to the rule, and the things that were not hearsay. she began to see that there were connections, that there were relationships between each of those. They weren't just 17 random rules in front of her, but there was actually a reason for those rules, and there was an implication, and the relationships began to make sense to her. Studying for the bar exam by using pattern recognition can be done in a couple of different ways. One, I think, is to use a visual technique to literally draw out the relationships, create a chart, create a graph, create a mind map. When you do that, you will visually see all of that information, and then your non-conscious brain, the part that is deeper in you but has more capacity, will actually take that information and use that to begin to see and to work through the material. Now, you remember in our previous discussion, we said the non-conscious brain is also nonverbal. It doesn't speak to us. We don't hear our non-conscious brain. We have to activate what it knows through pictures and images and feelings. And so mind maps are a great way to enhance that work because they speak directly to the non-conscious brain. So as you're studying, one of the things I think you want to do is to move away from what I describe as linear note-taking. You know, linear note-taking is you sit at your laptop or computer and you type furiously, verbatim if you can, what is being said to you. It's one way of learning, but it's not the only way, and in general, it's not the most effective way. It's much better to take your learning in chunks and use different skill sets. So I listen or watch, I hear that material, I read it or photo read it, I then do question practice and I review that information and the explanations, and then I come back and do it again later. That whole process is called spaced or stepped repetition. We've talked about it in other places, but it's a way to get at the patterns. I begin to see the patterns of the problems so that they become familiar to me. Now, in practical terms, there are a couple things that this means. Let's say that you're doing evidence essays in your jurisdiction and you're having this problem with evidence. You just can't seem to get it. One of the things that we recommend is to take a study period and to do several essays in that subject. Now, depending on how long essays are in your subject, that might take you 3 hours or 6 hours. But the essence is you write an essay and then immediately you review the model or sample answer and you review the written materials that you need to get at the depth of it. You begin to see the patterns in that problem. Oh, this was a problem about hearsay, and here's the kinds of problems that came up. And is this a hearsay dispute or not? Maybe it's non-hearsay. Maybe it's hearsay with an exception, whatever it might be. I see that pattern. Now I do another evidence question, and lo and behold, there's another hearsay problem, and I begin to see a growing pattern. I can see that beginning to develop. If you're creating mind maps, you keep adding to your mind map as you go through each answer. If you're creating a graph or notes, you keep building on that note set. After you've done a few essays in that topic, you will begin to see repeating patterns. Oh, the examiners in this jurisdiction kind of ask the same question, just with a different, one day it's widgets, the next day it's cars, the next day it's, whatever it might be, but it's the same problem over and over and over again. Once you begin to see that pattern, you begin to develop pattern recognition. And now when you see that problem again, you know what you want to write about. Oh, they're going to be asking me about this part of the problem. Here's one example that comes up all the time. In evidence essays, very frequently, we see problems about subsequent remedial measures and offers to settle and existence of insurance. Now, for whatever reason, those three items get linked together frequently on bar questions. So once we see the pattern of that, we say, oh, look, there's a subsequent remedial measure. That will trigger an understanding of the rule. And then I can say, you know what, my pattern recognition tells me I should be looking for an offer to settle or evidence of insurance because those are often linked together. And sure enough, there they are in the next call of the question or the next part of the fact pattern. And because I see those patterns, I'm now able to respond because I've written answers to them before. Now, maybe it's not an essay concern for you, but it's more of a multiple choice, multi-state question. Same idea applies. In our course, we'll have you do 20 to 30 questions in a subject, review the answer explanations, then set the subject aside for a while, and then come back to it and do 20 or 30 more questions. Set it aside, come back to it again. But as you do those questions each time, what you're doing is you're looking for the patterns. Oh, I saw this kind of a question before in question number 10, we had it, and here it is again in question 20, and it's the same kind of a problem, and you see the response will be consistent. and you look at the answer explanation, and sure enough, it is. And now you add that to your notes or your mind map or whatever it might be. And over time, you build a repertoire of pattern recognition. You begin to understand this is the way this kind of a question looks. This is what you're doing. Years ago, there was a company in Bar Review that claimed that they had all the questions. In fact, their owner was actually arrested for trying to stuff the MBE in the front of his pants and walk out of the bar exam. That was an interesting moment. And he was sued for copyright infringement. But his entire premise was that if he had the actual questions and he gave you the actual questions, you would be successful. Well, he was half right. It was right that if you had the questions, you'd have an advantage, but not for the reason that he touted. The real reason would be that you had the chance to see the patterns of the questions. And it was only by doing the pattern recognition that you got the real wisdom. In other words, it wasn't just memorize the question and the answer to this question is A, it was seeing the pattern. And the reality was that if you could see the pattern, you were okay. Now, the good news was you didn't have to cheat to learn how to do that. You just had to be licensed and get the real questions. And we've done that for 30 years. So it's possible to see the patterns by doing the questions. The same is true for performance tests. The same is true for essays. You see enough questions, you see enough patterns, you can study for those. And you should be making notes of those. Now, it might be that what you want to do, you might say, well, I'm not much of a mind mapper, but I like taking notes and keeping a journal. That's fine. Create a section of your journal called patterns and set it up by subject. And when you see a pattern in an essay or a multiple choice question, something that repeats and you say, I've seen that before, write that down as a pattern. Why would you write it down? Well, it's a way of talking to your non-conscious brain again. It's identifying to your non-conscious, this is something to be looking for. You know, maybe you've had the experience of buying a new car. And before you bought the car, you were blissfully unaware of that model. But the day that you're driving home from the car dealership in your new car, you suddenly see that car everywhere. Why? Well, you've given your non-conscious the command to look for that car as a way of affirming your choice and your decision. And suddenly, all you can see are Nissan Rogues everywhere you look. It's like, where were all these cars? And then you see commercials on TV for the Nissan Rogue. And then all of your friends at cocktail parties start talking about their Nissan Rogue. And suddenly the whole world is filled with Nissan Rogues. Guess what car I drive? Now, the idea is that our non-conscious, once it's given the clue as to what to look for, will go out like a heat-seeking missile and find that item and then bring it back to us. So I guess less like a missile and more like a good bloodhound. But the idea is that it gets that information, brings it back and says, here's what you need. So once you start identifying the patterns as you study, you'll be much more successful. Now, that is the broad scope of how I think you should use pattern recognition when you're studying. In our course, we're going to talk about it, and we do talk about it a great deal more, but I wanted to just give you a flavor for that today. Well, what about on test day? Do you use pattern recognition? And the answer is absolutely you do, and this makes all the difference in the world. Let me talk about first what I think a traditional typical bar student does with the MBE, and then what a pattern recognition student does. So a typical student gets an MBE question and they immediately start to read it, and they read it very slowly, looking for all the details and all the nuances. They start second guessing all the word choices in the fact pattern, and they start, their mind is racing and they're trying to memorize and say to themselves, what area of law is this? What rule do I remember? What's my mnemonic for this? And in that midst of that chaos and frustration, they get down to the 4 answer choices. And now their first step is they start trying to eliminate wrong choices, and they start looking for keywords, and they start asking themselves, well, if and only if, what could that mean? And what do I do with this? And maybe there's a hidden subtext here. And they start trying to power their way through the question. Now, for most bar students, that will take about 2 to 2.5 minutes to do a typical MBE question that way. And the chance of getting it right is actually relatively low. In fact, when we look at it statistically, the average score on the MBE across the entire country is around anywhere, depending on the year, from about 135 up to 140 scaled score on a 200-point exam. So that means that there are probably 80 or so questions out of 200 that are missed. Now, it's not a great way of studying or taking the bar exam. Some people pass, most people fail. We know that statistically. So I would say it is not a preferred method, in spite of what you've heard from the big box bar reviews. Empirically, it's not the preferred method. Well, what does a pattern recognition student do that's different? Well, as the pattern recognition student gets to the question, they relax, they read the question rapidly, not speed read it, not quickly, but just rapidly. And as they're reading the question, instead of doing what the traditional student does, which is to try and parse the words and think about the rules and all of those things, the pattern recognition student says, does this remind me of anything I've seen before? Have I seen this pattern, this type of problem before? If I have, what did I do with it? What was my response to it in the past? And then that student begins to preform the broad outlines of the answer. Plaintiff wins because. Defendant wins because. I'm looking for that kind of a broad general response. As I finish up the fact pattern, before I look at the 4 answer choices, I now quickly skim over the answer choices to see if my previewed answer appears as one of the 4 choices. It often does. And when that's the case, I mark that and then I just move on. I don't go back, I don't review it, I don't worry about it, I just move on. If I don't see my previewed answer, now I get a little bit more detailed and I think a bit more about the pattern. What's the pattern that I saw before and how did I respond to that? And is there anything here that deviates or changes that pattern? If so, can I use that to help me find the correct answer choice? If I can, I mark it and move on. But if I can't find any of those things at all, instead of wrestling with the problem and trying to eliminate answers, work through in detail, all I want to do is take a moment and close my eyes and literally for the count of 1, 2, close my eyes to just clear, open my eyes, and now look down at the answers and which answer jumps out at you. You might say, well, what is that, voodoo? No, it's not. It's your non-conscious brain telling you what to choose, dummy. Your non-conscious is saying, this is the right answer, just pay attention. And the more you get used to listening to your non-conscious, to honoring the inner voice of your wisdom, all the things we talked about in the first part of this series about paradigm shifts, the better off you'll be. So you look down at those answer choices and you say, okay, C looks good to me, and you mark C and you move on. You don't go back and think about it. Now here's the other key to pattern recognition. A pattern recognition student will do an MBE question in an average of 90 seconds, 90. By doing it that way, they're going to finish 100 questions in 2.5 hours, which means there's plenty of time for breaks and rest and relaxation. They're not trying to power their way through the exam. What does that mean? Well, MBE scores go up. Results are higher. Empirically, our students do better on the MBE than you see traditionally, and certainly for repeat bar takers, we see huge jumps, 10, 20, 30 points or more, because now instead of trying to force your way through the question, you're responding to the patterns that you see. And the better you get at identifying the patterns, the better your scores will get. So that's one way that you use pattern recognition. What about for an essay question? Well, it's really much the same process. As you start to read the fact pattern, you're looking for the patterns. What do you see in the problem that reminds you of what you've done before in practice or what you've read about or what essays you've written as you were studying for the bar? As you think about those and you begin to organize your answer, you're doing exactly the same thing. You're starting to put together the patterns that you recall and answering the problem using whatever writing style you prefer. We teach a specific style that makes great advantage of pattern recognition, but whatever you're doing, even if you're a horrible IRAC writer, which I think is the worst kind of writing for the bar exam, you can still use pattern recognition to help you understand what patterns, what rules, and what application you want in your answer. And so as you identify the pattern of the problem, you begin to draft the response that you want. You're not trying to work from, here's my memorized set of rules. Instead, you're responding to the problem, to the pattern that's presented to you. The same is true in a performance test. If you're taking that, you look at it and identify the tone and the audience. That's a pattern. You go to the library and you look at specific information that you are looking for that is patterns and patterns in the way it's presented. You go to the file and you look for patterns there, and then you draft your answer based on that information. Now, there's a lot more to tell you about all of those components, but I simply want to point out that someone who is a pattern recognition student will take the bar exam very differently than someone that is just trying to force their way through it. They're trying to gut their way through it. They're trying to remember and learn and know everything. Look, here's the point. Your non-conscious brain can know everything, but your conscious brain can't. And so if you're trying to function with what's above the waterline in the iceberg, you're almost certainly going to lose. It's only when you use the mass of information that's in the non-conscious brain that you really get the greatest advantage. And the way you get to that mass of non-conscious information is by allowing it to see the patterns and give you the response, to decode the information in a way that makes it usable to you. When you do that in your study and on test day, you're going to see remarkable changes in your results. We've seen students go from way under the pass line to way over the pass line. And what changed? They just simply started seeing the patterns using their non-conscious brain. That can happen for anyone. It can happen if you're a foreign trained attorney and English isn't your first language. It can happen if you're dyslexic, or you have ADHD, or you're terrified of exams, or you have enormous stress, or you've been worried all your life about taking the exam, or maybe you've been taking the exam for decades. We have great case studies, videos that we've done with successful students who represent all of those situations. And the consistent pattern that you'll see in those is that they found a way to see the patterns in the questions and to apply what they knew to use their non-conscious to be successful. So when it comes time for the bar exam, what I want to leave you with is to change your paradigm, to stop trying to rely on what you know consciously, to trust your non-conscious and to build that up in the way that you study and prepare. And then on test day, to use pattern recognition as your friend to help decode the exam and to make it make sense to you so that you can pass the bar and make the next bar exam your last bar exam. That's our message for today. I know that this is a little bit different, a little bit more academic perhaps than we normally talk about here on the podcast, but it's so important, I think, to understand why changing the paradigm of the way you study and then applying that to pattern recognition can make such a huge difference. So I hope I've sparked your interest and intrigued you a little bit. If you'd like to know more, there is a link on the show notes page for you to schedule a free consultation with me. I'd be glad to talk with you about any of that. I also want to remind you again that we have our free webinar. It's called Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. It's on demand. All you have to do is jump down to the show notes and click on the free registration, or you can go to celebrationbarreview.com/webinar and sign up there, and then we'll see you on the webinar, and I really encourage you to do that. All right, well, that's it for this week. Good luck to everyone who's still waiting on their results. We'll keep you informed as those big jurisdictions start to release throughout the end of October and November. We're still waiting for California, Texas, Georgia, and New York. So we've got some big ones still out there. So good luck to everybody, and we'll see you next week along the Extra Mile.
Thanks for listening to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at www.celebrationbarreview.com.